With that, let's get rolling here. Talking about the New Deal in Texas, which is incredibly understudied and not well understood, I would say, in Texas writ large. But what we talked about to set it up for today, and what we talked about last week during our history happy hour last Monday, is how Texas got pulled down and subsumed by the Great Depression. And we talked about a lot of things. We talked about how cotton collapsed, went from 28 cents a pound down to 5 cents a pound. We talked about how oil collapsed, in part because demand went down, and in part because of overproduction in East Texas. And what was amazing about that is how fast all of that happened, right? I mean, it just rolled over the Texas landscape, kind of like the dust storms of the Dust Bowl did in the early 1930s that are happening at the same time. And we talked about how Texans try to cope with this, right? A lot of people denied that it was happening. A lot of people said, let's just be positive and we'll be okay. But reality was hard to hide from when people are losing jobs, when people are unemployed, when people can't feed themselves or their families, right? And by the time you get to 1933, you have 25% unemployment across the United States. And we talked in detail about how that affected Texans. It affected everybody on every level. And as we talked about last time, there was a real emotional aspect to this that is important, I think, to try to capture for our students about just how emotionally draining and terrifying all of this was. I told you guys the story, my favorite story about that, about my own grandfather and how emotionally he was affected by all of this many, many decades after he'd experienced it in the 1930s, because it was just this searing memory. And I love using images like this. I mean, this is a heartbreaking image. You can see the distress in the eyes of the husband and wife as they're dealing with their circumstances. And Texans all over the state are coping with very similar circumstances. Folks like this turn to help. And we talked about that at the end of last Monday. Texans turn to their family members and then local organizations like churches for help. All those collapsed quickly. They went to the local government, they went to the state government, and basically they got nowhere because everything collapsed, everything at every level. So finally, in 1932, Texans and Americans writ large turn to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who campaigning for president in 1932 against Herbert Hoover, which honestly, Kermit the Frog could have been elected president in 1932, running against Herbert Hoover after the disaster that was the Depression. But FDR had a lot more to offer than maybe Kermit would. And what FDR was promising was to give Americans a new deal and to remember, as he said, the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And that sounded really appealing to most Texans because the old deal was terrible. It wasn't working very well. So this new deal's got to be something. FDR had not really explained what the New Deal was exactly, just that it was new and better, and let's try to do something. And as we talked about, Texans turned to that in earnest. And so the essential question I want to start with you guys for our first half of today is, why did Texans and how did Texans play such a crucial role, because they will, in bringing the New Deal to Texas? Because we'll see, it's going to be Texans at the forefront of passing New Deal legislation and bringing all of these programs that will create this New Deal into places like Texas and really across the entire United States. And then we'll also talk about why it transformed the state in such profound ways, because it will. We've talked about all this period as this crucible that Texas will go through, the 1930s, and then with World War II, the 1940s, that will transform the state. Well, the New Deal is a big part of that transformation. The Depression brings Texas to its knees. The New Deal is going to start rebuilding Texas, and World War II is going to finish that process. All right, so we're going to talk about how that happened. Now, Texans, to answer the question, why were they at the forefront of building the New Deal? It's because they wanted to do something about this economic crisis that had reached such massive proportions. I mean, when FDR is inaugurated in early 1933, that's when unemployment hits 25%, and it's really the worst it's ever been. And we've seen this map for the 1932 election. I mean, you look at Texas, again, it's so blue, it's purple, is how supportive they are of this New Deal opportunity. So FDR takes the oath of office on March 4th, 1933. It's the last time we'll ever inaugurate a president in March. We move it up to January after this. And when FDR takes office, the first thing he does is he declares a quote unquote bank holiday, where basically they just shut down all the banks across the United States for a couple of days. And the idea is to give a sense of like, we're doing something about this problem. We're going to shut things down and we're going to fix things up. And then after they reopen the banks and kind of get things going, they kind of shook the American people and said, all right, we're going to do something here. We're going to get going. And FDR gets on the radio on March 12th, 1933, as you can see in this image here, and delivers what become known as, it will be the first of what become known as his fireside chats, where he's talking to the American people through the radio from ABC, NBC, CBS. So many Americans owned radios, not everybody, especially rural Americans often didn't own radios. But this was the closest that most people had ever gotten to hearing the president speak live. It's hearing him over the radio. He's explaining, we're going to go do some stuff. We're going to start this New Deal. And FDR started explaining what the New Deal was, or what it's going to turn into being. And what the New Deal was, more than anything else, is a whole lot of programs. So here's some, and I mean, I put some in parentheses because there's a lot more New Deal programs than this. But there's a whole bunch of different agencies that get set up, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the Works Progress Administration, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, Civilian Works Administration. These all have very boring names, like just like blind you with boredom kind of sounding names. My students roll their eyes when I say Civilian Conservation Corps. But these are incredibly important because what all these different groups do is that they are meant to put people to work. And if there's any way to just sort of like have a one-sentence summary of what the New Deal was, it was jobs programs more than anything else. It was jobs programs that were meant to hire Americans to do work of all sorts. And the idea was if you could hire Americans to do things, the federal government could pay them, and they could count on getting a paycheck regularly, and they would go to work and be able to spend money, and that would get the economy up and running again. It's the same basic idea. Now, these were not programs that usually just handed out money to people like welfare in the sense of like, you don't have a job, so here's some money to feed yourself with. There were a few programs like that. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, had some of its money devoted to giving it to people who otherwise just aren't going to be able to feed themselves. So that's a very small piece. The vast majority of these programs are, again, putting people to work the way that the Civilian Conservation Corps did, CCC. So the CCC was one of these programs that's actually based on something Roosevelt had done while he was governor in New York. It hired young men, usually between the, we can see in here, from 17 to 24 years old. And the idea is these young guys are going to go get paid to do some work, and $30 is what they get paid a month, which sounds like nothing today. The guys only got 8 of that. 22 of those dollars went back to their families, the moms, their dads, or whoever's back at home. And this was a way of getting money into American hands, but also in exchange for work, so that this would continue on and people could count on it. Like there's a certainty that you're going to have this money that's going to matter in making sure you feel secure enough to go buy stuff. And that's what's going to get the economy going. So the CCC built all kinds of stuff. And here in Texas, the Civilian Conservation Corps, it did a lot of work on our state and the national park in Big Bend, out in West Texas. If anyone's not been to Big Bend, you're missing out. It's an amazing place. But a lot of the trails that were out there were built by the CCC. A lot of the cabins that were out there were built by the CCC. A lot of rest stops across Texas were built by the CCC. They built all kinds of infrastructure in all kinds of different places. And that's what a lot of the New Deal programs did, is that they built infrastructure of all kinds that will later become a boon to Texas and the United States when we get after World War II, because it's going to be the bedrock that we build the 1950s prosperity on. But one of the best examples of this is something called the Works Progress Administration. which was a program that hired not just young men in their 20s, but men, predominantly men, not exclusively men, but predominantly men, of all kinds, to do all kinds of work, right? These guys are digging a sewage line, which is not glamorous stuff, but my goodness, isn't it nice when your city can handle sewage and all the things that go with that and have clean drinking water as a result, right? There's all kinds of projects, infrastructure projects in cities across Texas that are being built as a result of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. They built bridges, they built sidewalks, they built buildings, they built buildings here at the University of North Texas, where I am broadcasting, if that's the right word, but where I'm speaking to you from, at a large number of buildings on our campus constructed by the WPA. If you walk around the campus today, I tell my students this when I talk about the New Deal in Texas, you can look down at the sidewalk and frequently see Works Progress Administration stamped into the sidewalk. In fact, if you're from a small town in Texas, I almost guarantee that your post office and or library was constructed by a New Deal program of some sort, and most likely the WPA. It was absolutely astounding. I mean, the WPA, as you can see here, it became the largest employer in the United States during the New Deal, hiring 8.5 million people, right? And they built across Texas, they built parks across the United States, they built parks in public buildings. You can see across the whole country, they build almost 750,000 miles of road. I mean, it's just an enormous amount of construction and infrastructure and things that are being created, sidewalks and buildings of all sorts. What's the point? To put Americans to work, doing useful things, useful projects, things that the country needs and will benefit from long term. But this is to get the economy going again. Because you guys remember last week, what had happened is the economy had collapsed because the banks had fallen. As I said, that's like taking the oil out of the engine because there's no money moving around. Nobody's buying anything, therefore nobody can sell anything. And it's just this impossible beast to get back up on its feet. The New Deal was the opposite of that. The New Deal was about getting the machine running again by putting Americans to work. And the federal government was the only thing that seemed to be able to step in and hire anybody and put them to work and give them money so they could feed themselves, clothe themselves, take care of their children, all those good things, and build large, important projects across Texas and the United States that will benefit the whole country long term, all right? Now, the thing I always emphasize about this that is important, I think, for our students to understand is that FDR's plan with the New Deal here is to resurrect capitalism or get it back up on its feet, not to replace capitalism. That's not his goal. FDR was very comfortable with capitalism and very supportive of the American system as it had been, but it needed help and it needed a tune-up and it needed to get back up on its feet. And so FDR's plan with all of this is not to undermine capitalism, but to get it going again, basically to shock the system. It's like, you've had a heart attack and you got the paddles and you try to shock. This is the worst metaphor I've ever done, but like, you got the defibrillator trying to get the patient's heart going again. That's the idea here behind the New Deal and all these jobs programs, all right? Now, the truth is, though, FDR can't get all of that legislation passed all by his little lonesome, right? He's only the president. He's not in the Congress. And so he needs help getting legislation passed. Who's going to help him get this passed? Well, it's going to be Texans. Specifically, John Nance Garner here on our left, who is the vice president under FDR. And then folks like Sam Rayburn here on the right, who will, in the later 1930s, become the Speaker of the House. You had a lot of very powerful Texans who were very highly placed in the administration and in Congress, who are not going along reluctantly. They are leading the charge in getting a lot of these New Deal programs started and getting them going and getting them funded. And the question is, why? Why would John Nance Garner want to do this? Why would Sam Rayburn want to do this? And the answer is because Texas needed help. Texans needed help, as we established in such great detail last week. And if the federal government is going to be giving money to help people, then these Texans would like that money to go where? To Texas, right? And so they managed to secure a large amount of federal funding that flows into Texas as a part of these New Deal programs, right? Federal government, you can see right here, invested $350 million in Texas between 1933 and 1936. During that 3-year period, $350 million pours into the state and starts hiring Texans, giving them jobs, building things across the state, and gets the economy in Texas going slowly. Still have a depression, all right? We haven't solved all these problems yet, but we're going anywhere positive away from 25% unemployment. We're making some pretty good progress, right? The other thing to remember about this is that Nance Garner and Sam Rayburn were also okay with this because they knew where the money was going to go. It was going to go to the state. The federal government did not put this money directly into anybody's hands. They just handed it to the state of Texas. And the state of Texas could decide how to distribute it with all these programs. That meant that the people who were already in charge of the Texas government would also be in charge of how this money was spent. Does that make sense? And that's important because then they're not giving up control. They're just getting more power to decide how this money is going to be spent. So almost all Texans, if you're writing notes, I highly recommend writing this down. At the beginning of the New Deal, almost all Texans and all politicians from Texas were very much on board and said, this is a great idea. Let's run with this as fast and as far as we can take it. Okay. There was not much resistance during the early years. Now, there were some problems, though. Not all Texans who needed help got much help. All right. The money that went into Austin was controlled by the people who were in charge in Austin, and they didn't always deliver the money to the people who needed it most. These guys, farmers, for example, didn't get nearly as much of the relief money as they were entitled to. The state government tended to give the money to landowners rather than farmers during this time. There's something called the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that paid for farmers to not grow cotton or not grow as much cotton so that that would help stabilize the price. The problem with that is that most of that money went into the owners of the land, the landowners, and most farmers who didn't own their land were tenant farmers, didn't get much of that money. So a lot of farmers missed out on a lot of the help that they were supposed to be getting. And if you were a minority group of some sort, you were much further down the priority list in terms of how money was being given out. African Americans had unemployment rates as high as 90% in Texas during the Depression and the New Deal period. And a lot of that is because they were excluded on purpose from participating in a lot of these programs. That wasn't the case with all New Deal programs. The National Youth Association, that Lyndon Baines Johnson actually ran that program in Texas. Johnson made a real concerted effort to include African Americans, but by and large, African Americans were shutted to the side and not given those same opportunities. Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans in Texas also were excluded as frequently as possible by the powers in charge in places like Texas. You guys remember from last week, we talked about people who are of Mexican descent were usually blamed for the Depression because it was rumored incorrectly, but it was rumored that Mexican Americans were the ones taking all the jobs that Americans could no longer get. And so during the Depression, there was this real anger and angst against Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals living in Texas. And so there's actually about 250,000 people who end up getting deported out of Texas and into Mexico during the Great Depression as they're pushing all these people out who were seen as competition for jobs. And so these people were also not given access to many of these New Deal programs. My point in saying all that is to emphasize that that money that's coming in, $350 million from the federal government, it's going to a lot of programs. Some of the neediest people aren't getting it, right? But that being said, the vast majority of Texans, average Texans, loved the New Deal and felt that it was making a positive and tangible difference in their lives, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. Like this image right here, I think it's really powerful. These guys can't eat, they can have a meal, right, that they've earned by working for the WPA, or that they're young enough, the CCC, or any of these other programs that are being established. And that was a powerful thing. It's an emotional thing to be able to provide for yourself or provide for the people who depend upon you. And so that had a big impact on folks. And it had a big positive influence on how Texans felt and experienced the opportunity for the future for themselves during the late 1930s. And some of those tangible benefits were really powerful. And I'll give you my favorite example of that. All right. Electricity. So up until the Great Depression, most Texans live on farms. All right. And if you live on a farm, it doesn't necessarily mean you have access to electricity. So I have a question. I want you guys to answer this in the chat for me real fast. Okay. So just take a second. But my question for you guys is, what percentage of American farms do you think had electricity by 1935? So throw a number into the chat for me. I'd love to see what you guys guess. Got 15%, 25%, 5, 25, 25, 3. Melanie's going low. Melanie's going low. Brittany's got 30, Andrew 7, Annabelle 25. All right, these are all very good guesses, guys. You guys are all a little high. All right. Michael nailed it. Thank you, Michael. It's 2. You believe that? 2% of American farms, which means 2% of Texas farms, have electricity by 1935. I'm not good at math. I can do this math, though. That means 98% of all Texans who live who don't live in cities don't have electricity. All right. Why? Because it wasn't financially beneficial to electric companies to run electricity out to farms. They were so rural and so far out there that it didn't make sense. It cost them about $5,000 for every mile that they strung up electrical lines. And so if you're doing that into really far distant places, it's just one farm out there. I don't care how much they run that toaster. The electric company's never going to get their money back. It just didn't make financial sense. So the electric company just didn't do it. And most Texans didn't have electricity as a result. Think about how important electricity is in everyday life. All right. They don't have access to that. So one of the New Deal programs was called the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. And the idea of the REA was that the federal government would help get nonprofit electric companies set up. If you have a local community that wants electricity, they'll lend you enough money to set up a nonprofit co-op, that's what they were called, electric company. And then that electric company would generate electricity and sell it to the local people as a nonprofit. And that would bring electricity to rural Americans, or at least that was the idea behind the project, or behind the program. And here's the thing, it worked beautifully. It's one of the most amazing, wonderful successes of the New Deal is the electrification of rural America, which means the electrification of rural Texas, all right? They strung up wires all over the place with federal funding that brought electricity to people's lives. It brought in opportunities for new politicians like Lyndon Baines Johnson here, which I got a whole shtick about Johnson, and I'd love to go into it at some point, but I'm going to give you the quick version on Johnson. Johnson kind of came of age during the New Deal, during the Depression and New Deal. And here he is on the right, shaking hands with his hero, FDR, here on the left. The guy in the middle is Jimmy Allred, a governor of Texas. And you know, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he got his first job, political job, running a New Deal program in Texas. But then he runs for Congress from the Hill Country of Texas, gets elected in 1937. And one of the first things he does is promise to bring electricity to the people of the Hill Country, people around Johnson City, Texas today, if you guys know where that is. And so this is LBJ right here with, I think, the most adorably short tie you could possibly ask for. With the group that helped set up the first electric company out there in Johnson City. And he brought electricity to the Hill Country, right? So here's a great picture, which was a staged political picture of him setting up a light bulb for a lovely older woman here who literally didn't have light before this, right? So what I want to emphasize to you guys is that so many of these Texas farmers saw real tangible benefits in their lives from these New Deal programs. They got jobs, they could feed themselves and their families, they had electricity. I mean, like that literally is bringing light to their lives in a way that it's hard to appreciate unless you lose electricity and the access to everything that it makes possible, right? The New Deal made that possible. And so to answer our original question, why are so many Texans at the forefront of pushing all of this through? Because it was improving their lives in ways that people could easily recognize. All right, so let me stop there and pause for a second. I'm going to jump here in the chat. So any questions you guys have or comments, I'm going to jump in there here in a second. But let me hand it over to my colleague Jay. Actually, is Jay here? I don't see. There's Jay. Hello, Jay. All right, so I'm going to hand to you, Jay, and take it away, sir.
All right. So what I tried to do is, I mean, I don't know about you guys that are teaching Texas history, 7th grade. This is a unit that I really want to spend some time with my kids about because there's such a Texas flair to it. And hopefully what I'm going to present to you, you guys can definitely use in the classroom. And let me share my screen. Here we go. All right, so what I've done is on the lesson itself, I have a hook exercise, which is just taking a poser strategy on a New Deal mural that was produced. If we click on it, and I have all this individual documents inside of Google Classroom for you. And there is an image here, I promise you that. My internet, I think the internet gods today are against me. But this is a image of the New Deal painting, and it's just kind of just a quick warm up that can be introduced to the classroom using posers. I've done this completely with fidelity. I've also had my students look at the categories and say, pick one and answer it. So it kind of depends upon how much time you have in your classroom. You can definitely modify this to meet your needs. I have 2 primary source documents ready for you. Both of them kind of come from Dr. Torget's presentation. The very first one is going to be discussing the Roosevelt declaring war on the Great Depression. I've taken his first inaugural address and kind of I didn't use it all. I just took the bits and pieces that I wanted to at least have my kids to kind of think about. And it just really kind of speaks to hopefully helping the students understand that this is a really dark, dark time in American history. And I don't think our kids fully recognize that, but then too, we can also pull in the latest pandemic when we were all self-isolating, how dark that potentially can happen too. But then again, too, you do need to tread lightly depending upon some students who have some issues still with that drama associated with the COVID. So this really takes bits and pieces of his inaugural address, and it really just tries to show that he is going to do something about it. He's going to be firm. He's going to ask for more powers, and that's always a good conversation with the students where you can have that discussing that president really was kind of limited, but now FDR was able to gain a little bit more power to help push through what he wanted to have done. The second primary source is The Forgotten Man that Dr. Torget mentioned as well. And I really like this one, kind of gives a little bit of background and then just talks about his radio address. The way I have these set up is in the primary source number 2, you have The Forgotten Man. There is a question that refers back to his first inaugural address that the students can use. But then again, too, you can also, I've had a teacher email me that we did during the fall on a couple documents, and they didn't want to use the entire document. What they were doing, they were pulling out segments, just a mini document, and inserting that into their presentation and having the students write about this in the classroom. These are both pretty good sized activities. You could spend, a good 45, 55 minutes on either one of these. And I know we've got our lessons that we have to teach as well too. But then keep in mind, you can make a printable activity, you can do it online. One thing that I did do, I had fun with was a version. I have two versions for you. One is a paper version of an activity. It's a web quest. It's nothing fancy. And what I basically have done is gone to, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's Texas Parks and Wildlife. They have a CCC website that they use, and that it is, I did a web quest first digitally, and then Michelle reminded me that not everybody has 1-to-1 ratio of computers out there. So I did a paper version as well too. And what this allows you to do, if you want to use this, make a copy of it for yourself, obviously. This is not in Google Classroom because I can't download it to make it functional. What I am going to do is I will share the hyperlink in there. And if you want to use this, you have the ability to be 1-to-1. You can definitely use this activity. It's 20 questions. It's not meant to consume too much of the class period. But it uses this website, which, as Dr. Torget talked about, it really allows the kids to read. And this is not a heavy interactive website. Its questions are pretty straightforward, and it allows the students to just really kind of click through and experience everything. And what I've tried to do is, even on the paper version, go to this website, click the main tab. I'm trying to get step by step. I don't want to waste the students' time trying to find things. And again, this is just more of an activity to explore the impact that the Civilian Conservation Corps has presented, or has given us in Texas, as well as throughout the United States. So you have this in Google Classroom. So that's available to you. But like I said, I will later this evening, I will put this hyperlink in there for you, so you have access to this as well too. I've used this website, but I haven't really, and I've used some of these questions. Some of this is stuff I've done in the past, but it's a fun little interactive activity. And then the very last one is Exit Ticket, which I tried to connect with Michelle a little bit more on this go around, the rural electrification project. I took one headline out of a local paper that is through the Texas portal. And then I also have, when the image loads, I have two images. This first image is talking about the health and comfort improvement by electric water system. This is the media really hyping the electrification projects in Texas to say, how well it helped rural homes. And then even another one where we see a national media where the Rural Electrification Administration has their own little ad or political cartoon that they're trying to promote and push, getting people to sign up in here. So this is going to kind of a direct tie into what Michelle's going to present later on. But again, you have the lesson, you have all the primary sources, the hook exercises, the paper version of the web quest. I will put the hyperlink in for the digital web quest for you as well too. And keep in mind, any of these activities, you can slice them and dice them and introduce it to your existing lessons. Don't think you have to use this all in its entirety. So that is what I wanted to present to you guys. I was actually very excited about day 3 because I had fun curating this. I had fun building some fun things, and I'm going to be excited to use this in my lessons going forward. Dr. Torget?
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. First off, I love the chat, guys. And I think it was Natalie who was saying that the connection between electricity and the winter storm we had exactly a year ago, I want to say. I think it was like this week coming up. A year ago, we had the great storm that knocked out electricity to so many people. So the more we can connect things to where our students actually have experienced something, I think all the better. I know that works for my students in particular. So I think that's a brilliant idea. All right, so let me pick back up on my little conversation here. All right, so second essential question is, so if Texans are pretty happy with the New Deal, and most of them were, why did some Texans begin to rebel against the New Deal during the second half of the 1930s? And that's a great question. Because it seems like things are going one direction and everyone's pretty happy. But the reality is, after 1935, so again, if you're taking notes, after 1935, there's a growing conservative resistance and backlash to the New Deal that gets bigger and stronger as the late 1930s go on. So we need to understand where that comes from, and it's going to help bring an end essentially to the New Deal itself. All right. Which is interesting because the New Deal made lots of things possible. And when it comes to Texas history, one of the most important events that has ever happened is the Texas Centennial in 1936. So the 100-year anniversary of Texas Revolution, Texas independence, all that stuff happens in the depths of the Depression during the New Deal. And you guys, I'm sure, know this, but Texas decided to celebrate this in a big and powerful way. And we took a lot of New Deal money from the federal government to celebrate our independence. But I always find it's kind of an ironic thing because Texans tend to hold up the revolution and independence and all, what makes us stand alone is usually what Texans like to focus on. So the idea that we're taking $3 million is what we got from the federal, from the U.S. Congress for our centennial celebrations is a little bit interesting and ironic. This is a great image of a ticket if you were going to go to the Centennial Exposition, which happened in Dallas. Dallas also put, the city of Dallas put several $1 million into all of this as well to help organize all of this. This is the Six Flags Over Texas and things like that. And this is the period starting in the mid-1930s going forward. We put up a lot of monuments across the state celebrating Texas history of all kinds, mostly around the Revolution, because it was a 1936 celebration, but it's using, again, federal money to do so much of that stuff. One of my favorite examples is the construction of the San Jacinto Monument, which was begun in 1936 as a part of the Centennial, and it was finished in 1939, 3 years later. And of course, the San Jacinto obelisk there, they put a star on the very top that makes it taller than the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. So take that, federal government. We'll take your money, but we're still going to have the tallest building we can possibly have. So all that happens in the midst of all of this. And Texans are very happy to take New Deal money to do this celebration of Texas history and the Texas past. All right. But there is a growing group of Texans who start turning against the New Deal and FDR in particular. And this all happens for a number of reasons. But one of the first things that shifts the perspective of some Texans is the passage of something called Social Security, which is created for the first time in 1935. And the Social Security system was established as kind of an old age pension system, because it's sort of counterintuitive for my students today because they think of the older people are, the richer they are. But that wasn't true through most of human history, and particularly American history. And in the 1930s, the biggest group of poor people in the United States were elderly people, because they usually didn't have retirement funds. They didn't have pensions for the most part. They didn't have anything to rely on, and they can't work anymore when they're too old to be able to do a lot of the jobs that were available. And so you have this massive problem of older people who can't work. So they can't take New Deal jobs. And this became a clear problem on a large scale. So the Social Security system was invented as a way of kind of dealing with that and trying to give older people a pension of some sort. The program was going to be funded by payroll tax deductions, and it would begin in 1937 officially is when it was going to start. And its benefits were modest. It would purposely modest, $20 to $30 a month when it first began. The idea was not to make it possible to just retire just on your Social Security benefits, but it was going to give a help to a lot of very poor elderly folks who may not be able to afford food or medicine or both. All right. But this is the pivot point. I want to draw a line across your notes here, because when they passed the Social Security, this is no longer just a jobs program. It's not about just putting people to work. Now it's about taking money from people who are already working and giving it to other people who didn't earn that money themselves, old people. And there was a lot of Texans, not everybody, but there's a number of Texans and a number of Americans who say that's socialism. That's a terrible thing. And we don't do that. We don't take from this person and give to that person. And so there was an unease and a backlash in some corners to the Social Security Act. And the idea that maybe FDR is going to take all of this and go a more radical direction than what he's been doing up until now. And if you're worried about FDR getting radical, oh boy, does he give a lot of does he give a lot of material for you? Because not long thereafter, FDR decides he wants to expand the Supreme Court. It becomes known as the court packing scheme. But basically, FDR and the Texans who were working with him had passed a lot of new programs that were unprecedented in American history. The government had never been this involved in the national economy before. And so there were different challenges to New Deal programs and how constitutional they were. So there were a lot of cases that went up to the United States Supreme Court during the New Deal period. And the Supreme Court was very old and very conservative and started just invalidating New Deal programs left and right and saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And that was alarming to FDR and for those who supported the New Deal. And so FDR was afraid that basically his entire New Deal agenda was going to get sidelined entirely by the Supreme Court. So FDR came up with a zany scheme. And what his idea was, I'll just appoint a whole lot of new justices to the Supreme Court, and they'll be friendly to me, and then I'll get better decisions from the Supreme Court. There's no constitutional number of Supreme Court justices. The Congress gets to decide how many there are. There were 9 at the time, and FDR proposed to assign a new justice for every justice who was currently on the Supreme Court who was over 70 years old. His justification was, well, these guys are old. They probably need some help. So I'll just appoint 8 more people. And that'll bring us up to about 15. So FDR proposes this, and it's a disaster, basically. Because what's FDR doing? He's packing the Supreme Court so it'll just approve his legislation. That's a pretty direct breach of the separation of powers in the US Constitution, right? That's just not how our system is meant to work. And this played directly into the hands of FDR's political opponents. So surprise move by the president. It looks pretty ugly. It gets to be a good-sized fight. FDR backs off, in part because he was taking a lot of political flack, and in part because the Supreme Court suddenly changed at that moment and started approving rather than invalidating a lot of his New Deal programs. And so it became kind of a moot point. But the damage for FDR politically had been done to a certain extent, because this played again into the fears that some people had, some Texans had, that FDR was doing things like a dictator would do. Right? So you have this political cartoon, which I think is really powerful for a lot of reasons, that kind of gives you a sense of that fear. So here's government reorganization. That's, all the New Deal programs. That's getting involved in banking and finance as a federal government in a way that we haven't before. Then the next step is Supreme Court revision. So they can't stop him from doing what he wants. And if he gets all the way up, he'll end up in the dictator's chair. Right? And here's FDR making his way up here. So there's a good number of fears that he's getting a little out of control here. FDR really wasn't, but that was the concern. And then you have this really interesting phenomenon that happens where the economy starts going bad again. So look at here. So this is unemployment rates, you guys can see. And in August of 1929, there's basically no unemployment. And then the Depression hits, and we talked about this on Monday. It goes all the way up to 1932, 1933. It's 25% unemployment, right? This is when FDR gets elected, he's inaugurated. And then you can see when the New Deal begins, immediately, unemployment starts going down very steadily, right? And it gets close to down to 10% by the summer of 1937. Well, FDR decided to pull back from a lot of these New Deal programs, a lot of these jobs programs, because he didn't want to run up the deficit any more than he had to. And when he did that, he basically took away some of the economic stimulus that's going on, and that meant unemployment started going way back up very dramatically. So you see this from the summer of 37 to the summer of 38, unemployment goes from nearly 10% back all the way up to 20%. This is called the Roosevelt Recession. And the point in all this is that really upset a lot of Americans, a lot of Texans who are just saying, all right, we've tried what Roosevelt's doing, and now things are getting all crazy again, and that's really scary. And when things go wrong, people tend to blame whoever's in charge, in this case, FDR, right? But the thing that was really a problem for a lot of Texans in particular was when FDR decided to go for a third term in 1940, right? So he was elected in 32, reelected in 36 by a wide margin. And then he goes up for reelection a third time in 1940. And that had never happened before. George Washington, our first president, had walked away after 2 terms. And that was considered, not just the precedent, but the right way to do things. And everybody after him had followed his precedent. You can see here, Jefferson had stepped down after 2 terms. Jackson had stepped down after 2 terms. It was not written in the Constitution you couldn't run for a third term, but Roosevelt decided to. And that just played right again into this narrative of he must be power hungry mad if he's trying to control the Supreme Court and he's going to be president for the rest of his life or whatever it looks like. And so there was a big movement of Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats in places like Texas, away from FDR in response to him running for a third term. So you can see here, these are no third term. Democrats for Wilkie. That's Wendell Wilkie, who was the Republican nominee in 1940 against FDR. Right. The best example of this is John Nance Garner. All right, FDR's vice president, who decided he couldn't stand and let FDR run for a third term. So he wasn't going to run for a third term as vice president. And so John Nance Garner abandons FDR, essentially, who had been one of his most influentially powerful allies in Washington. Garner leaves and says, no, I'm not going to have a part of this. Which is why, by the way, quick aside, it is not John Nance Garner who becomes president when FDR dies during World War II. It'll be Harry Truman. All right, that would have been Garner. So Garner walks away. More colorfully, I like to tell the story of Martin Dies as a really good example of how these Texas politicians, shifted their perspective about the New Deal over time. So when the New Deal began in 1933, 1934, Martin Dies, he's a politician, he's a congressman from East Texas. And Martin Dies was all on board with the New Deal. It's like, yes, we need jobs, we need money, we need to get all this stuff going. He was all in favor of it, rah, rah, rah. Then 1935 happens. The Social Security Act is passed, and then FDR does his court packing scheme. And it looks like FDR is going a little too far. And so Martin Dies he makes an about-face shift and decides, you know what, I've changed my mind. I think this New Deal is basically just communism. So he makes this giant mental leap that it's just communism, it's terrible stuff. And so Martin Dies starts looking to undermine the New Deal wherever he can, and he starts looking for communists anywhere he can. This is a good echo of what's going to happen later with McCarthyism during the 1940s and 1950s. And so Martin Dies, he helps found something called the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, which is also going to be a platform for Joe McCarthy later on. But here he is yelling about communists everywhere he can find them. And so Martin Dies by the late 1930s is so anti-New Deal, he's trying to seek out communists anywhere he can find them who might be supporting the New Deal. And so he actually goes to the University of Texas and raids a dorm room, because where are you going to find communists but at the University of Texas, I guess. He raids a dorm room, doesn't find any communist literature or anything like that, but that doesn't stop him from making wild accusations every which way he can. And so the thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that you have this conservative movement during the second half of the 1930s away from the New Deal and against FDR that is never the majority in Texas, but it gains increasing steam and it gains increasing political influence. And I think the best example of that, my favorite example of that, is this guy right here in the middle, William Lee, nicknamed Pappy O'Daniel. All right. I love me some Pappy O'Daniel. He is such a fun story, and he's a fun story to tell your students because he has a really colorful history. He's a bit of a disaster, but he's a really interesting guy. So he was a flour salesman, and since it's Valentine's Day, I want to emphasize, I mean flour you go cook with or bake with, not flowers that you bring home. In Fort Worth, he had a flour company there, and he realized that a great way to sell flour was to use this newfangled thing called the radio. And so Pappy O'Daniel here, he got his nickname Pappy because he had this radio program that he started where he had this whole band, the Sourdough Boys, behind him, and they would play music and do this whole kind of hoop-de-doo on the radio that Pappy O'Daniel was the MC of, and he'd read poetry and he'd give little talks and he'd do songs with his band. And the whole thing, when the program started, there was a woman's voice that said, "Please pass the biscuits, Pappy," which became his nickname, Pappy O'Daniel. He was very popular, and it made him a household name amongst average Texans. And he was a well-known figure. And then in 1938, on his radio program, he announced that he was going to run for governor of Texas. And the reason he said he was running for governor is because he'd gotten all these calls from average Texans saying, "We need you, Pappy. We need you. We need you to run for governor and help us fix all the problems that we've got in this state." And so he announced he was running for governor. He never run for political office before in his life. But in 1938, he runs for governor, and he basically takes his radio program on the road as his campaigning style. So this is a rally at the University of Texas, where you see here's Pappy in the white with the tie right here, holding his arm up, holding the microphone. And this is his van. You can see that he's got a speaker hooked up here where he could podcast himself basically on the road. And he'd get up there and he'd be entertaining and all that. People would ask him, "What's your platform? What you running on?" And he'd say, "Well, I believe in the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule," which are lovely, but aren't really a campaign platform you can examine or push against. I don't know anyone's going to run against the Golden Rule. He's just kind of saying bland sort of things so he doesn't get pinned down on them. He didn't really have a platform. But people would ask him, "Hey, Pappy, what do you think of this New Deal?" And he said, "Oh, love the New Deal. Fantastic. Good for America, good for Texas." Right? He had to say that because he was trying to get all Texans to vote for him. And the average Texan, the average poor Texan, which is most Texans, still were big fans of the New Deal. Right? So he needs to get their votes. But what did Pappy O'Daniel really believe? Well, it wasn't in the New Deal. I'll tell you that. He was a part of this conservative coalition that was turning against the New Deal. And he'd actually been asked to run, not by his listeners, but by a consortium of businessmen in Dallas who were trying to find ways to undermine the New Deal because they thought it was bad for Texas and bad for America and all that. So they financed his political campaign, and it worked amazingly well. Pappy got elected, claiming to like the New Deal. But in fact, he hated the New Deal, or at least he was willing to work against it. And as soon as he was inaugurated as governor of Texas, he started undermining the New Deal every which way he possibly could. He slashed budgets to everything he could. He refused to use New Deal money for New Deal programs. And famously, he kind of cut back on just about everything within the state. And so while Texans remained very enamored with the New Deal and remained very popular amongst most Texans, and you can see here in FDR's re-election campaign, he carries almost every single county in Texas except 2, right around, looks like, I'm not sure exactly what it is, near San Antonio perhaps. So average Texans love the New Deal, but that conservative coalition is pushing against the New Deal. And the conservative coalition, I want to emphasize, is successful in stopping a lot of these New Deal programs from going forward. And so the New Deal starts kind of slowly grinding to a halt by the late 1930s. By the time you get to 1939 or 1940, FDR really can't pass any new legislation. He can't get any new stuff through the Congress. And so the New Deal is just kind of limping slowly along. We're not done with the Depression. We're most of the way out of that hole, but things are still kind of dicey. And what's going to take us the rest of the way is a war started almost exactly at this moment by this terrible person who is going to basically ruin everybody's day for several years in the late 30s and through the first half of the 1940s. All right. And so it's World War II that's going to complete this transformation of Texas from what we started this series with this rural Texas that was mostly farmers and very poor farmers that are brought to their knees with the Depression. The New Deal starts giving them jobs, giving them opportunities, and then a lot of them abandon their farms and take New Deal jobs in cities. And World War II is going to complete that whole process. So I want to emphasize a few quick things here about the start of World War II. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Michelle here in a second. All right. So I'm sure you guys know the origins of World War II in Europe come back to the end of World War I, and a lot of the economic consequences that was put on Germany. They had, after World War I, they have to pay a lot of reparations. They have to dismantle their military, and then they have to deal with massive inflation that is a result of that. So this gentleman right here has a wheelbarrow full of German Deutschmarks, the currency in Germany, which he's probably buying a loaf of bread because they had such massive hyperinflation that you really just couldn't buy anything whatsoever. That opened the door to the rise of a lot of anger and angst within Germany, who amongst average Germans, especially in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, felt like everybody else was getting ahead and they were not. And Adolf Hitler rises to power with his Nazi party by saying, hey, your problems are not your fault. Your problems are the fault of all these other people. It's the fault of Jews. It's the fault of these foreigners who are forcing us to not be our true selves. And so Adolf Hitler starts building himself and his party up through the ranks in Germany. He becomes Chancellor of Germany. His party then outlaws all other political parties and starts building up this massive military that it unleashes in 1939 by invading Poland. I'm going to skip Austria and Czechoslovakia here for interest of time. But when Germany unleashes its war machine in 1939, Texas and Texans are still in the throes of the Great Depression. Right? But most Texans don't want to be involved in this war in Europe. All right? They're still dealing with the Depression and they're distracted by that. And that is far more important to them than dealing with whatever's happening in Europe or what's happening in the Pacific, even with Japan's invasion of Manchuria and China. And so most Texans are opposed to getting involved in this war in any way, shape, or form until December 7th, 1941, right? And with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Texans now are brought together with the rest of Americans in a big and powerful way, and they recognize that they are in this war whether they like it or not. And so Texans start lining up literally here. This is a line in Houston for the recruitment office to join the United States military in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And when this happens, this will continue the process that was begun by the New Deal of putting Texans to work and remaking the state of Texas. And so what we're going to talk about next week is the way that World War II just tremendously transformed Texas in all the most fundamental ways into the state that you and I recognize today. So with that, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Michelle. So Michelle, why don't you take it away?
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Hello, everybody. It's good to see everybody tonight. And it's good to be surrounded by educators and not middle schoolers, just as Andrew said earlier. You guys know it's a rough day in middle school, Valentine's Day. All right, let's take a look at a lesson plan that I've got for you today. The first one is all about, it's a hook exercise about Lyndon B. Johnson's life in Texas. He's somebody that I really highlight. You know, he's our claim to fame here in Texas. A small. I like to start with LBJ's information in my classroom early on so that I can build off of his experience in Texas. He really allowed all of his experience in Texas to shape his political career, and he was a middle school teacher as well, so that's super cool. This hook exercise is just kind of like a mini inquiry that you could do in your classroom. there's a little bit of information about his presidency. I give that piece to my kiddos just so that they understand what his presidency was all about. It was, as you guys know, he spent a lot of time with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and all that. And then I take them back to his time in Cotulla, little town Cotulla. This is a picture of him. He's right in the center of all of his kids. He taught 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. He was the teacher. He was the principal. He talks about the fact that he was like the coach and the everything else, really. He even taught music for a little bit. He said he tried to teach music. And so this gives them like a really good, and that was brave, by the way, because if they asked me to teach music, I would, that's when I bow out. But this gives us, me and the kids, my kids love seeing this information about President Johnson. And this gives us a good insight into like his foundation. Moving on to slide number 5. This was his time in the National Youth Administration works. This is what he brought to Texas. This was his platform as he moved on into his political career. And this little piece of information talks all about the electricity that he brings specifically to Brenham. He brings it to Texas. He brings it to all small town Texas, but this gives good insight. This little clip gives good insight as to like how it really transformed Brenham into a bigger, more production, more better conditions for farmers, that kind of thing. And so it wasn't just electricity for them. It was improving their way of life in a really big way. There's a student document to go along with that. I'm not going to open it for sake of time, but it gives them a directive through essential questions. So, and something to write on. Continuing on, this is just some really great information about the CCC and really what it did here in Texas. There's some background information, a great little poster to go along with it, but also this is the bulk of the lesson. Mr. Hendon, Claude Hendon, he was part of the CCC. He worked in it. And so this is a great back and forth interview. Many of you were talking about your grandparents or your great grandparents and how they really benefited from programs like these. And so this is a grandpa or great grandfather. And so it's really good insight as to what the CCC provided for these families. And he really mentions like we would have starved without this. So this is a great question and answer back and forth kind of situation. And then there's some analysis questions to go along with that. And then the very last one that I've got for you guys is the exit ticket. This is just a simple comparison of the youth programs here in Texas. The CCC focused on young men. The NYA, right here in the center, National Youth Administration, focused on young men and women. So it's a little bit more inclusive. And then the Federal Music Project really grabs a lot of my students that are interested in the arts. And it provides a way in a different way than just like a outside hands-on kind of position. It gives them an outlet and it gives them an opportunity to express themselves in a really cool facet. The Federal Music Project was also more inclusive than the CCC and the NYA. And so really what I'm asking my students to do here is just compare or analyze the 3 posters and compare them to one another. I've got some analysis questions down here to guide their thinking, but you can give them a little, I've also done this. I wanted you to see this before I closed it out. You can give them some background information on these, and actually I've linked the background information to these little pieces down here. So if they're doing this online, if they're not doing a paper version, they can take a look at the background information. You could guide them with additional questions if you wanted to. But this just really gives them a good idea of what the youth went through during that awful time of the Great Depression, and how they survived, how the government supported them in those ways. I would say that you could also give them some kind of extension as to what that looks like now, or what that looked like even 2 years ago with COVID. How did the government step in and help in situations? And so maybe they could make those modern day comparisons to this kind of stuff. So that's all I've got for you guys.